Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their edtech ideas into profitable businesses. Hi, Amy. Good morning. Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneur Show. Thanks so much for taking your time out for this.
I am so happy to be here.
Great. And I'm super excited as well. Amy, my first question is how did you get into education and specifically test prep? Did you plan growing up? Was that what you wanted to do? Or is there any other story?
So while I did go to college and get my degree in secondary education, my intention was to be a history teacher. However, I did not have the most positive student teaching experience in a school for a few reasons. So I left college thinking I do not want to be a teacher. But
Okay.
very quick, and I assumed a role working at a sales training firm as a receptionist, answering telephones. Yeah, which I had done through college. But in any case, pretty quickly, a few months went by, and it was December 31st, 1993, where somebody mentioned to me that Princeton Review was hiring instructors, and I remember thinking, well, I have a job. Why would I do that? But of course, because my degree was in education, I thought, well, you know what? Maybe I'll check this out. So I did get hired. Now, interestingly, they wanted to hire me as a math SAT teacher, and I was like, but
Right.
wait a second, I am way more of a verbal teacher. But in any case, I, kind of took the challenge on and was willing to get trained to do SAT math, which, to be fair, probably was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I mean, I was good in math, but not in a way where like that was something that I was thinking I was going to teach kids. But long story short, I fell in love with working with the tests. So for me, it was immediately something where I recognized while maybe being a teacher in like the public education sector was not my path, it was pretty clear to me at that point in time I had sort of found my space. And I think that's what the most reassuring thing for any student, graduating from college is that degree, so many fields, degrees can lead to so many different paths. And so I think sometimes we have perceptions about what some particular degree will be. And yet here I am in education, but not in the traditional role of teaching in like a high school.
Got it, Amy. And what was the difference that you found in teaching for a private test prep company versus, the history teaching that you quit or you didn't want to pursue?
I think there were a couple things, but probably the most important thing, and you'll hear this from a lot of test prep people, getting to work with students who are sort of self-selecting, right? They're choosing to work with you because they have goals, they have aspirations, and they understand that getting a good test score kind of opens doors, whether that be for college admissions, whether that be for scholarship. And so you work with a different type of student generally who it's targeted work, you kind of dig in. I also found that I do like working with students over a shorter period of time. So for me, you know, I like the idea that over 6 to 12 weeks, I'm going to work with you. There's a number you're shooting for. We're going to get you to that number. And at the end of that time, quantifiably, we know when our work is done. And I think as a teacher, not that I wouldn't have enjoyed that, you don't get that same sort of, you know, kind of recognition or realization that you've done something for a student. So we're kind of spoiled, I think, in the test prep industry because our students trend to be motivated. They trend to be goal oriented. We can accomplish a lot in a short period of time. Those results are measurable. We know what they are. And then, of course, they move on and get to pursue, sort of their aspirations, their professional dreams. And you get to be like a part of that journey. So to me, it's a very exciting time too, because you're sort of at that sort of crossroad of where they're leaving, high school and going to college. And we get to sort of kind of connect with that a little bit. So even though I didn't go to Harvard, it's fun when you're like, I'm sending students to Harvard, or I didn't go to Notre Dame, but I'm sending students to Notre Dame. And so I think you feel like you're a part of that journey, and that's exciting.
Got it, Amy. And you said, you've, found that your sweet spot is somewhere between 6 to 12 weeks is, what you'd like to
Mhm.
work with someone,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So, why is that? And how did it come about? I mean, did you design your course to be of 6 weeks, or, did it happen over a period of time?
So obviously I've been in test prep now for like over 30 years, and I've worked with thousands and thousands of students at really all different levels. So like at my companies, our students can come to us with an ACT score of 14, or they can come to us with an ACT score of 34. They can come with an SAT score of 900, or they can come with a score of 1550. I think when you have worked with students so long and you know where they're starting, or you look at their individual section or subsection scores, you have the ability to sort of recognize, making a few assumptions about the student, kind of what that sweet spot is. Now, I will be honest in telling you, we get students at any point in time, but we traditionally will say, if we have the time, we'd prefer to start with you 6 to 12 weeks before, which means we can meet weekly, we can meet for an hour, and we will feel like you're getting enough review, you're getting enough homework time, and that's really important, is being able to have students do homework, work on practice sections, practice tests. But the key thing is we've also seen a number of students on different tests realize significant results in a really short period of time. So, for example, even with an 8th grade high school admission test, I had a student a couple weeks ago who only did 2 sessions and improved his overall, national composite percentile by 18%. Well, that 18% for him meant the difference of getting a scholarship. So the key thing is, for some students, you really sometimes don't know what amount of quick work, targeted work can achieve a goal. So we do say to families, we'd like this amount of time, but we will not turn anyone away unless there's no space if we can help you. So, for example, what that means is, for a lot of these tests, for example, the ACT, many, not all, but many colleges will superscore. So imagine if someone comes to you and they only have 2 weeks, and you can say, look, let's work on this English score, and we're just going to work on English for the next 2 weeks. You may see some dramatic results in English that student can take that English score, and then, maybe they are going to take the test again after that and work on other areas. So there are ways, depending upon the student's goals, depending upon what colleges they're interested in, that you can try to figure out a tutoring plan that will facilitate that, basically. But we do, in our traditional class, small group class, that is designed to be a 12-hour program. So it is a 12-hour program where students typically meet over 4 weeks before a test. We see them 3 hours every week, and we're dividing our time up over the sections. And then, fingers crossed, giving them assignments and hoping that they will review or complete those assignments so that they come back to our classes well prepared to ask really good questions that are specific to themselves and where they're at score-wise.
Got it. And another interesting thing that you said, a lot of test prep companies have diagnostic tests to see, where students are. And I haven't heard anybody, turn away somebody because they don't meet a certain minimum score. But you said, you take for ACT, if they have even scored 14, it doesn't matter. Even if they are 34, it doesn't matter. Or for SAT as well.
Mhm.
What's the change in approach, and is the time duration for preparation different for these uh, two set of
Different
students?
scoring levels. So I guess, again, I would go back to, families come to you when they have a need or when they learn about our services. So that is where
Right.
customizing a program is critical, because, if a family does learn of you late in the process and they still want your service, if we can accommodate them, we do. But but we are very honest with our families in saying, that, there's like a waiver of liability. We're going to do what we can for your student, but we want you to understand that given more time, right, we would have preferred more time, or we might say, here's what we're going to try to work towards. But know that when you get the test result back, you might have to come back for more work in a different area. But it can certainly look different at different scoring levels. For example, one of the things we know is that if a student is coming to us really low in math, let's say for the ACT, this is more specific to ACT math, but let's say they're coming to us and they don't know any of their geometry formulas, they literally don't have those memorized. Then it may be for a lower scoring student, we're going to very much launch initially into just getting into the geometry, getting into those rules or formulas in a way that for a higher scoring student, we might say, here's a list of formulas, go home, look them over, ask questions if you need to. But the expectation there is that higher scoring student is not going to need the level of review and interaction over a list of formulas as a lower scoring student might, much like punctuation rules. If you're starting with a lower scoring student and you're expecting them to be able to identify when something is a sentence or an independent clause, you can show them a list of punctuation rules and very quickly they can apply them. But we sometimes will find with a lower scoring student, when I use the term sentence or independent clause first, they don't even know really what that means. They can't even identify a sentence versus a fragment. So that same student might be able to review and memorize those rules, but they're not going to matter if you say put a semicolon in between two sentences when they can't tell what a sentence or a fragment is.
Right.
So then it's going to require more time and more kind of digging through questions to really provide relevant or appropriate instruction to support that. So those are some of the differences. A higher score is oftentimes going to come to you with far more fundamental core academic knowledge that just requires a little bit of tweaking versus someone lower. You may have an expectation of like, okay, here's what they probably don't know, and here's where we're going to start.
Got it. Any another question, I'm kind of curious to know the answer for is it simply the knowledge gap uh, that is responsible for students that are low scoring and students that are high scoring from your experience, or are there any other factors to it? Why do you think, students that are low score and the other group?
So I think that's certainly a complex question. I will say yes. I mean, it would be rare for a low scoring student to come to me and them not have a significant knowledge gap. It would be very, very rare. However, that is not to say that a high score doesn't have content gaps as well. It's just they may be relying upon their instincts or intuition to answer questions in a way where that actually can serve a higher score well. But I will say too, when it comes to reading, and this is where with reading, no one in test prep that I know of in our industry would suggest that like, oh, reading is a score that can be significantly improved overnight. Because with
Right.
reading, now every passage a student is going to get is going to be different. You will never see the same passage again. And even if you did, it might be a different question. It might be focused on
Right.
a different reading skill. I think one of the dilemmas can be, especially for a higher score in certain areas, is they may have the knowledge. They may have the knowledge of grammar. They may have the knowledge of math. And then they get to a reading section and they're not a reader. They don't read. So imagine if you're not a reader, there are a number of things you're going to lack. The most obvious is usually being able to understand figurative references, figurative language
Mhm.
versus literal. That's probably one of the most, so you can have somebody who does really well in school and English class, and yet they are not able to read text and pick up on when an author means something other than what they literally say. And I see that a lot. And it's not, it shouldn't be surprising, because when we think about, at least in the US, when students attend an English class, they are primarily reading books, reading literature. That is probably the foundation of curriculum. They can be assigned a chapter or chapters to read at home, and they can go home and read those. And I put in air quotes, they can read a chapter at home, right? But what they take from that text,
Right.
they can miss a lot. But imagine that you then go to class where your teacher is going to discuss that material. And imagine you didn't pick out a lot, like, you know, the nuts and bolts, but you didn't pick up like the nuance or the subtlety of what was going on. Your teacher is going to talk about that. Your teacher is going to tell you, like, if you didn't already ascertain it for yourself, your teacher's going to tell you. And then you're going to go, sure, I get that. That makes sense to me. And your student's going to take the notes that is what they should have pulled out of the text independently, and yet they didn't. And so now imagine that student is going to read over those notes to study to take the test. And they get an A, because guess what? Who told them what they read? Who digested that reading material for them? Their teacher. Or it could be their classmates in conversation or discussion in class. And so, for example, most reading that is occurring, most comprehension that occurs in the high school curriculum occurs because there's a conduit. Your teacher typically, or your classmates. Now, when you move to a test where you're sitting, it's you as an individual, it's the test, and you're timed, there is no mediator. There is no one to sort of,
Right.
whisper in your ear, hey, did you pick up on that figurative reference? Do you understand contextually what that word means? And so this is, I think, the modern dilemma of education, and why even standardized test scores do not seem to represent where some students are achieving academically in school. It's because, well, they have a lot of academic support in school. And I'm not criticizing that support, but I am explaining why there can be a really big disparity for some students. And reading happens to be a place where I would say it's the most obvious, because if students are not readers independently, like, reading is a muscle. You're working the muscle of your brain. And we don't see it. We don't feel it like we do if we're working out the muscles of our body. But our reading muscles needs to be flexed in our brain. And you just don't get that if you are not an independent reader. And so that's why a lot of kids in test prep are trying to make up for something very quickly that some kids just gain by virtue of reading throughout the course of their elementary, middle school, and high school years.
Got it, Amy. So now, from what I heard, I interpret that majority of them, at least the people that I know in my circle, not a lot of them read. Everybody has a certain sort of aversion towards reading. They just, procrastinate if there's
Most
anything given
people,
to read and stuff like that.
most people reading is 160 characters or less, right? I mean, in a typical day, most
Right.
people's reading is about 160 characters or less. And in those characters, people are trying to really be concise and simple. So we're not even seeing the use of complicated words or more advanced language or more complex sentence structure. So yeah, so no, go on. But that is what constitutes most people's
Right.
reading.
So, I mean, have you solved this for, test takers? Have you come at hacks, or, have you created some shortcuts? Is there any, first of all, or are there instances where students, despite not being interested readers, have gone on to score great scores?
I think again, I would go back with the lower the starting score, the harder that climb will be, right? So it's almost like If
Okay.
someone's starting really low in reading, you don't see that sort of, really like big jump automatically,
Right.
typically. Um, Now, again, where it gets interesting is above average testers or really higher testers. Some of those students may actually be readers, let's say. So, in those particular cases, you're really tweaking the skill they already have. You're refining it, right?
Mm.
You're getting them to see things in a way that they didn't think as much about before. And like, so for example, it's saying to a student on the SAT, when you look at that reading question, do you know what the task is? Do you understand when they want to know the function of something or the purpose of something, um, or the logical completion or conclusion of something? Do you understand what that means? So, what is the task? And then when you read that passage, are you thinking about how that task should influence your reading? Right. So, as you're reading, if I know I want to look at a main idea, I might focus more on, at least on this with the ACT, where it's long form reading, I might focus on the topic sentences of paragraphs to get sort of the building blocks of the essay. These are the main points of the paragraphs. How do those main ideas work together to then create a more universal main idea for the passage? And so one of the skills that I find fascinating is having students paraphrase, having students predict what they think the answer will be before they ever look at the answer choices. Now, what's interesting about
Right.
that to me has been most students don't do that. They jump immediately over to answer choices. They give themselves no opportunity to, I always say, let it gel in their brain by paraphrasing and putting in their own words. We know from education that like there's the knowledge level, you know, and then there's comprehension, and then there's application. And when you don't, like when you just read something and go right to the answers, you're not allowing your brain to start really sort of wrapping around it, if you will. And so by paraphrasing that simple act, I have found over the years, if I can get a student to sort of hit the pause button in between the reading and looking at answer choices, now I say, you have something in your brain that you've come up with that you're comparing every answer choice to that expected or predicted answer. And so in that case, a lot of students, especially if they are good readers, now all of a sudden they can very clearly see how an answer choice has nothing to do with their prediction, which makes the elimination process much easier, much better. Not always like you're going to get the right answer, but the point would be it's that simple act. And I actually say to students, I use sort of this analogy of Jello. Our brains are like Jello. And if you make Jello, it's liquid and you put it into a Jello mold. And almost immediately that Jello will form shape to whatever, sort of whatever mold or bowl you've put it in, even though the inside is still very much liquid and it takes a while for it to gel. The initial outside shape is formed very, very
Mm.
quickly with Jello in a way that now you can't get it to be any other shape, despite the fact that everything inside is still liquid, right? So if you think about reading and you think about the fact that 75% of answer choices are wrong, when you don't take that moment to process what is it I read and make that prediction, you would then, if you don't do that, you allow your brain to gel on a wrong answer. And when your brain gels around a wrong answer, much like that Jello initially, you kind of can't get it back. You kind of can't unthink it. And so wrong answers are very suggestive to students in a way we do not want our brains to gel around a wrong answer, which is why we create the gel prior to going over to answer choices. So to me, I find that to be interesting if students can kind of grasp that and sort of follow that as sort of a strategic model.
Got it. I mean, interesting. but this the you kind of touched upon, what I was going to ask, towards the end. What if the student, because let's say if there is a question and if I'm trying not to read or, have a look at the options, I tend to
Mhm.
see what I'm naturally arriving at. Now, what if that is wrong? And, are you kind of biased?
Well, I mean, so to be fair, what you would be describing is going to be a weaker reader. Like the weakest reader will derive something that is nowhere in the text. And unfortunately, I'll be honest with you, in test prep, if your student is literally pulling information out of a hat, meaning, where did you read that? Now, what I will do with a student is I will pull them back to the text and say, show me where you read that. Very often, when you do that with a student, they can't show you. And then they'll realize they made it up in their head. Now, this is what's interesting. With a long form reading of 650, 700 words, if you just read the whole passage, you have a lot of information floating around in your head where you're making connections, which is what your English teacher would say is what you want to do, but not so much on an SAT or ACT reading. You want to stick directly with the text. So the only thing you can start to do with that kind of student who pulls something out that's completely wrong is you have to say, show me where in the text that idea formed in your brain, right? Then at least you can start to try to figure out how something they read might have triggered something, some association. And potentially that association is way off base, right? And sometimes that can come because we do, as readers, we do apply context. We do apply prior knowledge all the time. We have certain expectations, right? Um, you know, I think that like you can look at a story and you can see in a character yourself, and you could then attribute certain emotions or thoughts that you would have to that particular character. And that may or may not be correct. But again, it's got to come back to the evidence in the text. So even though you might have had a similar experience to a narrator, if that narrator is not describing something in a way that was true for your experience, then that narrator is going to have different ideas. And you've got to be able to separate that you're attributing things here that simply do not apply. And so I just will say that's where it becomes harder. A lower scorer is going to struggle with that a lot more. But I do think that even though, like, for example, and I will say the SAT tests way more with vocabulary knowledge, and that can be problematic. ACT doesn't so much directly test vocabulary knowledge, but that's not to say there aren't times where there are words that if a student doesn't know them, that one word could unlock a meaning that now you're like, oh, I didn't realize that ambivalence was uncertainty. Now I understand this narrator is really unsure, uncertain, unsettled, right? So sometimes that can happen in a way where it's like, ooh, vocabulary can sometimes be a barrier. Even if it's not a vocabulary word that's really hard, it just might be a word that's like student didn't realize that, and then that's going to change their understanding.
Got it, Amy. Well, first of all, this is a very interesting way to, tackle a reading comprehension. Just don't look at the
Mhm.
choices, see what you come up with. But obviously, what level of a reader are you to be able to do that is another thing. So now is this where you help students choose whether ACT or SAT is right for them? If somebody is not having a great reading foundation, would you say SAT is the test for them to take?
Well, I think most of it is in test prep because obviously our entire careers, when you're in test prep, your entire career and even your own professional success is always going to be tied to numbers, right? I mean, that in this industry, everything is about the numbers, right? And so I would say we start with numbers. So we start with if you I think you were suggesting before even about whether a student took a diagnostic or didn't take a diagnostic. I mean, in our industry, the ideal is certainly that someone has taken a practice test. If they haven't, we would certainly strongly suggest it to launch the work. But even still, I mean, even some of our students come to us, and maybe the first or second session as we get to know them. And maybe we do give an assignment after the first or second session to take a test. We'll get those numbers. But with the numbers, you're looking at the numbers, and there are scales, there are conversion tables where you can lay out, here's what that SAT or PSAT score was. Here's what that ACT score is. And if you look at the numbers, you're going to find that for I think many students, you're going to find if the number is higher, much higher in one column than another, that is a clear, typically, indicator of this is the test you should stick with. Now, I will say there are there are some exceptions to that. The first of which being, sometimes like for SAT, and SAT, you only get 2 scores, math, and then the reading, writing. If a student's coming to us and let's say that math score is really high, well, then we might just say, wow, we only have to work on the reading, writing modules, right? That is only really half the test. Whereas a student for the ACT, might say, wow, if I'm weak in science and there's no science on the SAT, is that something that would lure me to the SAT? Not necessarily, by the way, just because science is low doesn't mean that you have to focus on SAT, but you might look at on the SAT reading, you have very short paragraph readings, and every reading, writing question is a different passage. For some students, shorter is more digestible, although I will say I think SAT readings are more complex. But for ACT, you get a longer reading. Now, that could be good or bad. You get lost in it, you get bored with it. But you could also argue when you have 10 questions about a particular passage, you get 10 times to interact with that passage where your understanding of the passage continues to take shape as you answer. And so for some students, that distinction could matter, or vocabulary. If your student is not a reader and they have a very weak vocabulary, it is going to be a struggle because building vocabulary for SAT is, I don't want to say it's shooting at a moving target, but I will say so far, they're throwing curveball words where, some students, if they don't know the word and they're not savvy at prediction and elimination, then that could certainly sort of knock them in their tracks. But so I think you can look at the scores, you can look at the individual sections. I mean, in math, ACT math is more about breadth of knowledge, but yet you don't have to know a lot about those individual math topics. SAT math to me they doesn't test very much in math, but very deeply in a way that many students will struggle to even recognize what the question in math is asking for. Even if they would know the information, they're just not making the connection. So that can be a challenge for some students. But I will say the one thing that the numbers, don't tell you is I do think that the lower the starting score, and generally I say the lower you are from whatever the average SAT or ACT score. So let's say that's roughly a 1060 on the SAT total or a 21 on the ACT. I really do not recommend any student who's got less than an 1100 on the SAT usually focus on SAT. So I'm very discriminatory about that. I do feel more strongly that students can improve on the ACT more quickly, more easily, which is why when there's a short amount of time, I do think that some of the skills you can teach in ACT can be taught more quickly. Whereas with SAT, I think it requires a little bit more. Now, I will say with the new SAT, we are seeing some changes there. We are seeing some more immediate results that we did not see in the past. So, jury's still out on that, I will say. But ultimately, what I do like to tell people, and this is to be really important, many students leave taking the PSAT or the SAT. Many students will leave feeling really good, feeling really confident, feeling like, hey, that testing experience was fine. Like they feel like a lot of the feedback and comments about taking the PSAT or the SAT now are very, I mean, to be fair, in testing, it's exciting to hear a student who says, that was great, right? But they are describing in that moment a qualitative testing experience. How did you feel about the test? And what is becoming very interesting is once those scores are known to the student, now we have to move to judging the test quantitatively. And very often, that qualitative assessment, how they felt about the test, versus the quantitative, what number did you get, at least in my, neighborhood, very often pulls them back to ACT. So it is really interesting because students currently will always tend to enjoy, and using the word enjoy is a very loose definition but they will say, my oldest daughter, and this was not on this SAT and this was a few back, but I remember her saying to my oldest daughter said, and this is really still true for the ACT, she said, I will take the SAT as many times as you make me. But she said, please don't make me take the ACT again. That was what my daughter said. Now, meanwhile, guess what? Her ACT was still way better. And she still took the ACT and did better and better. And long story short, she works for me and now she gets perfect scores on the ACT. So for what it's worth, just don't let anybody tell you that how you feel about a test should dictate which test is best for you. And unfortunately, a lot of the messaging out there is pick which one you like best. No. You don't pick which one you like best. You pick which one is going to give you the number you're looking for because it's all about the number, right? Ultimately. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. There was a lot of layers to this. I mean, usually people say, if somebody is better at reading, take the ACT. If somebody is better at math, take the SAT. That's pretty much what I've heard. But the differences are some people would say, let them take both the tests and, whatever number is higher, they should go and take that test. But I mean, I think this section was the depth was amazing in terms of what are the factors that students have to keep in mind before they take that. But while you were describing these two things and how SAT there is suddenly an increase in scores, I'm starting to wonder now. All the universities in US, do they look at both the SAT and ACT scores without any discrimination, or is there any differences?
No, there
Some
is no.
universities
So
prefer.
right.
Okay.
So for parents, the parents of today's students applied to college still in an admissions environment where there was like a mandate. So for example, when I went to college in the 90s, it was true that colleges would say, we only want SAT or we only want ACT. And you would see even regional differences of preference. You would see Ivy League preference, East Coast, West Coast preferences. Since 2007, I still remember this. The headline, the frontline story of it was USA Today in 2000. It was like April 2007. Said every college in the United States will take either the SAT or the ACT on equal footing, and that has been true since 2007. Now, that is, I mean, it's good and bad, right? I mean, when a school says to you, we only want your SAT score, you're like, okay, I must focus on SAT. That is what my mandate is. If a school said focus on ACT, that is your mandate. That is not the mandate now, because obviously now colleges will say submit either. Most kids, to be fair, submit one. They focus on one test, they prep for one test. But like I was going to say, the good and the bad. The bad is that you have to figure out on your own which is your test, right? So as we're learning, I mean, one of the challenges now in college admissions is that, and it's not a challenge, I would just say it's a difficulty, is that we're at this point where students have so many choices. Now, it starts with the fact that there's thousands of colleges to even look at or apply to. Don't even get, that's one thing. But then you get into, okay, you have different tests. Which test? SAT or ACT? Make a choice, figure it out. You have testing policies. Test required, test preferred, test optional, test blind. I think that students today are confronted with so many choices, which is great and yet scary, because the more choices one has to make, there's a risk that you miss something and maybe you make the wrong choice, right?
Right.
But the key thing is to understand from parents and students, there is absolutely no preference between the SAT or the ACT in terms of colleges. I have just as many students getting into Ivy League selective schools with ACT scores as SAT scores. So from my perspective, I have never seen a student not get admitted somewhere by virtue of the fact that they should have submitted a different test. Yeah, just simply doesn't happen.
Got it, Amy. I just had a funny thought. You can just let me know how you see this, because ACT is said to be, a little more complex when it comes to its reading sections than SAT when it comes to its math sections. So somewhere I wonder, and these are two competing tests, right? I mean, both of them would
Yes.
want their test to be taken more by the students. So
100%.
are they competing? And students are going to choose. Yeah, there are two things. One is what they are comfortable with. One more is this perceived notion of what's easier. And I'm sure there is a large group of students that think of these tests as, okay, which one is easier, probably who don't know so many layers are there to choosing. So somewhere are they also competing to make it easier against each other? Is that one of the downsides of this, would you say? Or how do you look at this?
I think that, we in the test prep industry, when a test changes, so think the SAT changed, at least in the US, in 2024. The ACT will be changing in the US in 2025. I think we in the industry, because we know this competition exists. So think about it. 30 years ago, there wasn't the same level of competition between the SAT and the ACT because they knew certain colleges mandated one versus the other. So they knew who their audience was. Now that it's sort of we call it the wild, wild west, it's an open market. You do wonder, we've certainly seen the battle over the years of, the SAT is going to offer a written essay. Well, guess what? ACT offers a written essay. ACT has their essay as a separate score, then SAT eventually makes the essay a separate score. We see the SAT changing and making itself shorter, fewer questions. Now, what do we see next year? The ACT is changing, making it shorter, fewer questions. So I think you definitely are seeing that competitive spirit as far as the product, i.e. the test being delivered. We are seeing the two companies sort of trying to mirror in some ways those changes. Do I think the companies are making the tests easier? I think that when SAT initially announced its changes for the 2024 test, I think we thought to ourselves initially, wow, you seem to be describing something that's an easier test, right? And it's never been quite so simple, right? Like they didn't mention vocabulary is going to play a greater role. They did mention readings. They said readings are shorter, easier to process, but they also called those SAT reading passage changes providing richer passages. And I remember like richer, that doesn't sound good. A richer passage sounds like it must be harder. And to be fair,
Right.
That's what we're seeing. Some of those really short reading passages are really dense and hard to unpack. So shorter comes with its own set of challenges. I do think with the new ACT changing, the initial changes that were announced, so I'm an ACT instructional mastery trainer. So what does that mean? It means I work for ACT and I lead trainings for teachers that are professional development. And while I'm trained to do any area of the ACT, my sort of wheelhouse is I generally do trainings in English, reading, and writing. Those are my three areas that they traditionally asked me to do trainings for. So I follow the test because I know in my trainings, I'm going to have to eventually start really speaking to the differences for teachers. And so I've watched this really closely. I was fortunate enough or privy that in that role, I did sign an NDA when they announced what the changes were going to be. So I was aware of these changes over almost a year in advance of the announcement. And so I
Right.
can tell you that I was like, okay, you're making it shorter. You're making it fewer questions, less time. That all sounds great. That sounds great. And then, as a member of the National Test Prep Association, we had a webinar with ACT in July. And as I'm listening to them explain more of the changes, I'm thinking, wait a second, this is not the same test. I mean, they are making those same kind of comments. And I'm like, wait a second. Some readings are going to be a little shorter. There's going to be an argumentative essay in English. You're going to do engineering or, design passages in science. This is not the same. This is different. So I do think that on a very cosmetic level, shorter, fewer questions, more time per question
Right.
is sort of what the competitive advantage was supposed to be for College Board. That is the advantage now ACT is trying to take back. But at the end of the day, these tests cannot award perfect scores to all students. And so what that means
Right.
is the scoring tables, the scoring scales per tests are going to have to reflect that. That's how psychometrics works. That's the basis or foundation for standardized testing. So for what it's worth, they are competing with each other hard. In a way that in my career, I have never seen SAT and ACT duke it out like they're doing now, which is only interesting because we've always said in my career, they're both nonprofits, or at least they were both nonprofits until last year or this past year when ACT was bought out by private equity. And now there is a nonprofit arm to the ACT that continues, but it is no longer operating within that nonprofit form that we would typically associate with a nonprofit. So again, they're out for market share. And so you are 100% right to think they are competing, but at the end of the day, they still have to produce reliable scores
Yeah.
that
Right.
colleges can use to validate. And so they will have to ultimately be answerable to colleges for that. So they've got to be careful by trying to create tests that pander to the consumer, i.e. the tester, because their client is also the college as well. Well, and
Got it,
schools,
Amy.
high schools are their clients too. They got three different segments of the market. It's the student, the high schools or the state boards of education, and then of course colleges. So they've got some different
Colleges.
audiences. Yeah.
Got it. So, yeah, they are competing, but definitely not competing to make it simpler or, easier than the other because, the standards have to be there. Apart from changing stuff from a competition point of view, do you think there are changes happening from the changing dynamics in the world? Like, for example, there is generative AI now, which has
Mhm.
probably made a lot of skills that we needed to have a few years back redundant now. Do you think these are also some of the factors that are going into the tests being changed to suit what skills are needed 5 years, 10 years down the line?
I would say to you that at least as far as AI goes, I don't think currently that what the tests are testing acknowledge the existence of AI. So I would say
Wow.
to you what
Okay.
the tests are testing, the tests are operating in a parallel universe without AI because what they're recognizing is that the knowledge and the skills that students need, the foundational skills. So let's just say number sense, right? Numbers. You still need to have some sense of numbers and what numbers do, because if you punch a number incorrectly into AI, it's going to produce a number that would be correct in terms of what you punched in, much like a calculator. Think much like a calculator.
Right.
You punch the number in, the calculator produces a result. And let's just say you have two very different students. The one with number sense doesn't even question that the number, that the output, was out of the range, out of the ballpark. Now, can you imagine in the working or professional world, someone without number sense putting that in a report, sharing it with their boss, right? Sharing it and making a recommendation where it's like, wait, you didn't even question that these numbers don't make sense, right? And versus a student who says, wait a second, I know I put these numbers in. That is not the realm or the range I was expecting. Let me go back and double check that. And I think that is sort of what I think is that, at least currently, you can put information into AI, but again, as we're learning, at least the current form of AI, it is only as good as the person entering the information, right? And so we're seeing that in terms of,
Right.
working with AI, or I should say at least ChatGPT, and we're thinking about how do we provide additional feedback to ChatGPT to refine or make it better. And so a lot of people will tell you, you can sometimes tell that it's ChatGPT because that student or that person didn't refine it. They just let it speak for itself. And maybe it's like, this doesn't seem quite right or whatever, as opposed to someone who might be, in terms of writing, a better writer. They're going to refine it and finesse it to make it sound like their own. And then sometimes it takes the human touch, if you will, the human element to do that. But I think the numbers and the number sense that I'm sharing with you is, to me, again, we can put information into AI, but if we are not putting the right information and we are not questioning or interacting with that result, these are some of the skills that we're seeing tested, right? Like understanding text, Now, I suppose you can put something into ChatGPT and say, read it to me like it's third grade, right? I did that the other day. I put something in and said, write it like it's an eighth grader, right? And so, but I think that's more about learning how to use some of the AI. I think the tests themselves and their current iterations are still about having the foundational skills so
Mm.
that you can be a critical thinker in a world where AI exists, right? I mean, I think that's because ultimately we still want humans to be able to think critically. Otherwise, the machines will rule, right? The machines will rule. So, yeah.
Got it, Amy. Amy, I quite didn't expect to continue on this topic, but I couldn't stop. I'm going to go back, deviate a little bit, and go
Okay.
back to, probably 1993, or,
Okay.
at least I'm going to think from there. You said you started off at Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
And where I'm trying to get at is, before you started Seeley Test Pros, I
Mm-hmm.
think you had one other transition, and then you
Yes.
started Seeley Test Pros. So what prompted you to, probably go out of Princeton and do what you did before starting Seeley Test Pros?
It's funny. It wasn't a conscious decision. I was looking for some part-time work as my kids were young. And I just was like, again, I started to think more about that private education. And I was like, oh, education has different there are different roles or jobs. And so I happened to apply for a position as like a part-time educator for basic skills. And because I was starting to raise my family, and
Right.
I basically started working for a local learning center in Cleveland, Ohio. And when I applied for this basic skills tutor job, my boss said, "Hey, I actually want to know more about your test prep experience." And so I actually did not get hired for that basic skills job. I got hired to initially be an instructor, but I think the intent she had when she hired me was to basically administer their test preparation program. So at the tender young age of 26 years old, I took over managing, hiring, training, curriculum development
Wow.
for a local learning center. And I did that for 10 years. So that was really my training ground for understanding much more deeply how the test prep industry works, how to run a business, right? How to market and sell and network and, every skill you can imagine that goes into having your own business. I got to learn and gain that valuable experience under under someone who really trusted me and trusted my instincts, and I just gained an invaluable experience over those 10 years, being able to do what I did there. Yeah.
Got it, Amy. And in the 10 years that you did that, what year, was it when you started probably contemplating, okay, can I do this on my own? Can I have my own company doing the same thing because I'm anyways doing it for somebody else?
So it's funny. Again, the SAT has changed a number of times in my career, and I had just done the entire revision of the SAT curriculum. This was in 2004 when it changed that time. That was that was my first test revision. That was the first time the test really changed in my career, was 2004 to 5. But in that period of time, I had another child. And then in that first year that she was here, managing, all that I was doing just felt overwhelming. It felt overwhelming. Um, Obviously, I had moved away from, I was doing tutoring still, but I was doing less of it. And so, many of us in test prep, your company can grow, and which is awesome. But very often as a business owner, or you've got to figure out, like, where is your role? Because if you got into it to tutor, you start to move away from that. So I
Right.
just I just kind of over a few months decided that it was, running a company for someone else was becoming overwhelming. And so I decided to launch my own little tutoring business, which I to even use the word business feels like an exaggeration, but it was like, I'm just going to tutor on my own, right? That was really what it was. I
Right.
wanted to get back to just the tutoring. And obviously I knew I would just manage myself. The referrals would come in, whatever. And so that was really my intention. I launched just my own little tutoring business that I was going to make a little bit more money because I was doing it by myself. And, within the first year, I was working probably twice as many hours as I thought I would. And over about 5 years, 5 years, it became crazy. Like, there were times of year where just the amount of students I was managing was insane. Um, but again, constantly fitting kids in last minute and getting good results. So therefore, when you do that, when you get good results in a little bit of time, people share your name, right? But then after basically about 5 years, I slowly realized, wait a second, if I had another instructor, I could kind of lighten the load a little bit, right? So then there was one instructor I think I brought on in like 2011. Then I brought another one on in like 2012. Then I launched group classes. I launched a website, group classes, and I realized, oh, wow, these other instructors can teach classes. And so it was amazing to watch myself be able to continue to tutor, but then to see with the addition of other people, the potential for the business to grow. And then, so then it just solidified. And then by 2014, I was out there trying to find other test prep professionals in the wild, traveling to Boston and meeting with people to find out, well, how does test prep work here? What does this industry look like here? And then by 2017, I connected with my good friend, podcast partner, Mike Bergen. And then that led to our podcast. And then that led to a Facebook community group called Test Prep Tribe, and then the National Test Prep Association from there. So the good news is I fell in love with an industry and sought other people who did what I did in other places, because I was like, surely there are other people out there doing what I'm doing, and probably doing it better than me, and I'd like to learn from those people. And that's indeed, I think, what I found is just the benefit of community to me, both personally and professionally.
Got it, Amy. I'm going to go back to that time you said, for the first 5 years, you worked twice as many hours that you did while you were managing it for someone else. But the very reason you wanted to start your own was, probably uh, do the same amount of work, but maybe probably make more money so that it's more rewarding. But
Right.
you ended up working twice as many hours. So my question is, does running a business that one owns, in this case, when you owned it, did it feel any different? Did it not feel that you worked for that many hours? What changed really, Amy? I'm
Oh,
just
yeah.
trying to
No,
understand from an entrepreneurship point of view.
so my family would say, "Oh my God, she works so many hours." But you know what they say? Um, Find a job that you love and you'll never work another day in your life. And
Right.
so when we use this word work, and this is awful because we obviously exist in a world where we all probably work way more than we should, and I know that's true. Um, there is this thing that when it's your own, right? When it's your own, and I use this example of being a baby. Actually, I kind of had this realization about 5 years ago. When you create a business, and I'm a mother, right? I have 5 kids. This is why I can kind of make this connection. I really feel like, my company is like my sixth child, right? In a way where like you bring it into life, you nurture it, you let it grow, you intervene, whatever, you make some changes, you tweak it. Um, Unlike a child, right, that you're raising to definitely let it go and to let it into the universe, to be independent. Many of us, when you start a business, it's going to be yours for as long as you want it to be yours, right? And so I think it's an interesting thing in terms of that nurturing and growing and tending to it. So to me, because I find that fascinating, and for us in test prep, we have the two parts. We have the pedagogy, we have the teaching, the instruction. I always call that my educator hat. But then we also have the business hat, like running a business. What does that look like? So for me, business isn't a part of who I am, but I have found that there's elements of it I love. I love, things that I do for the business side of it. So um, I think that the work part of it's tricky because when you love the work you do, working too much is an ongoing struggle because you want to be on the computer sending emails, respond, like you get like pulled in. And so I think what I'm learning, I should say, I'm trying to teach myself are the boundaries of between work and personal life, right? Because it can be very difficult as a business owner to draw those lines because you want your business to succeed and you fear that if there's something you're not doing, you are starving this child of yours, right? Like, because that's sometimes how I see it. So, yeah, yeah.
Right.
You got to have a healthy perspective. Yeah.
Got it, Amy. A couple of questions about the educator hat and the business hat. So is it 50-50 currently, or where is it now?
It depends how many hours there are in the day, Jag. Um, I mean, currently I am doing a lot. I'm doing a lot of both. I mean, I'm doing a lot of both. So it's a delicate management because obviously there are the times of day that one has to be teaching or tutoring if you are scheduled to teach or tutor. Um, and then there are, like we were just saying, those hours of the day, of the evening that one can extend very, very late, like I did last night working on some presentations. Um, but I would say currently it's probably, it feels like it's 50-50 for me right now. It's 50% the teaching, the instruction, and 50% the business lady. Yeah. Yeah. I've never had more meetings during the week, during the day than I've had in the last couple of years where but again, it's that business development. You're always networking and meeting
Mhm.
with people and you never, and I think the thing that one of the lessons, and this is true for both the teaching and the business part in the, is just, you never know who you're going to work with or meet that creates an opportunity that you cannot imagine if you never had it. And that's true for families. When you get referrals of students, you never know if this is going to be the one family that now opens up an entire referral tree or an opportunity that you're like, I am so lucky I had that opportunity. And so the same thing with meetings. You never know who you're going to meet, that you're going to learn something or meet someone where you go, oh, I never thought of doing that or doing it that way. And so I think that's why it's tricky because you're continually driven to meet and whatever, but because you just don't ever know what possibilities. Like, I feel like the world is full of endless possibilities and I'm always afraid I'm going to miss one of them. Yeah. So.
Got it. And before I move away from this, in the business hat, you said there are things that you like, there are things that you don't like. What are they? What are the ones that you enjoy, and what are the ones that you'd want to outsource or have somebody else do?
Um, so let's talk about content creation. Okay, let's talk about. So I love networking, collaborating, meeting new people. That's what I love. I too have a podcast, right, Jag? And I, as you could probably imagine, am somewhat of a talker, right? So the podcast is easy. It's networking, it's talking, it's just you hit record, then the audio, it's like that's easy. So I love that. That's probably one of my favorite parts of what I do. That, by the way, I get paid $0 to do, but I love that. Um, the flip side of that would be writing, blogging, producing written material. Now, that written material, it could be a
Right.
written blog, it could be a newsletter, it could be an email. I hate creating text like you have no idea. It is so when we talk, and actually this is something I've really been thinking about over the last really month or two, is I do know from some of my very good dear friends in the industry, one of the pieces of advice that I need to sort of follow going into the new year is as a business owner, find the tasks that you don't want to do and outsource them. Hire someone
Right.
to do them. And so I will tell you that this idea of the blogging, the writing, that is probably my New Year's goal for 2025 is find someone to do that, because if you don't like it and you hate it, you don't have to let someone else do it. Now, and again, with the advent of ChatGPT, I am currently trying to harness some of that potential to make my life easier. So for what it's worth, it's like I'm trying to do that. But yeah, I would say to you, like writing, blogging, any of that written stuff. And the thing is, I'm a good writer. Like that's the hilarious part. What I spend tons of time with students editing or talking about grammar and writing, and yet the actual creation of it is a painful task to me. Yeah.
Great. This was insightful. Yeah. And yeah, while you were describing about how your workload is only increased, I wanted to ask you this. This was a question that I had in mind. Usually, business owners, right, what they try to do, it's the beginning 5 to 10 years. It's the most difficult part, and everybody dream of a point where they build something, they outsource it, and then they just have to manage it. Work probably a fraction of what they used to work. But in your case, obviously, it's evident that that's not the case with you. So, what's your outlook about this entire building business? And but you seem like you still want to be in the thick of things, right? It's kind of that's what you enjoy.
I can't. I think I do. When you say in the thick of things, I think that would be a good way of describing me. I mean, I'm a Gemini. Now, I don't want to subscribe to like astrological like philosophies, but I'm a Gemini. So what does that mean? I'm a talker. I'm a social person. I I love knowledge. I love ideas. I love information. So I've never been more well positioned with all the things that I love. Right now, the other thing, if you don't know about Geminis take on tasks all the time, and they are
Right.
notorious. They are notorious for not finishing them. So, I mean, if you read the profile of a Gemini, like that is Amy Seeley. So, for me, this is all about kind of giving me life and energy. And, I just worry because obviously that's the challenge of a business owner. Putting your hands into too many things, then nothing ever gets done. Nothing gets ever done to maybe the level that it could have been had you sort of,
Right.
kind of pull back. So this has been a very busy year for me. I bought another test prep business, Leap, in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I took a
I
big
was going to
leap,
come to that.
no pun intended, this year in terms of taking on another company. And that has been a very humbling experience to try to learn another company, even though it's in the same industry, to take on a legacy created by someone else, right? Who is in the business, as long as I've been, learning a whole new market of people. But I'm really excited to see that I can sort of merge these two companies, and really create sort of this idea of some kind of symbiotic relationship, or where they're both better off because of the synergy that I create. So this is kind of the challenge I created for myself, but it's an exciting one because, again, I have never been more well sourced by other business owners, and specifically test prep business owners. And so I'm very I'm very lucky to have the encouragement, the support, the knowledge, expertise of my, test prep colleagues across the country. So to me, it's a challenge, but I also feel like I've got a lot of support from other people, which is excellent.
Got it, Amy. Before we, there's about 15, less than 20 minutes left. Couple of stories that I'm yet to touch on. So that's my key thing for the next, whatever time we've left. So I want to start with the NTPA. NTPA, how did NTPA happen? Please.
So that is, again, that's another baby. That's another child of mine. But so long story short, if you're familiar with the college admission space, there was this scandal called Varsity Blues. And when Varsity Blues broke in terms of the scandal in college admissions and people paying people to take tests or test scores not being valid.
Okay.
And I just wanted to talk to somebody. I was like, wow, I would love to have someone to talk to about this, because it's the world I live in sort of isn't inside of that context. And so I had met Mike Bergen, who is another test prep professional. He owns Chariot Learning in Rochester, New York. And Mike and I had met, and we were talking here and there periodically. So I, at one point, and because podcasting was really becoming popular, and this was in late 2018, I thought, God, I think I'd like to have a podcast. But I was like, there's no way. I don't know anything about that. That isn't like in my wheelhouse. But I thought I'd love to do this. And so I one day thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to ask Mike Bergen. I wonder if I need a partner. And I thought, who would my partner be? I'm like, I bet it Mike Bergen. So I reached out to Mike and I said, I have an idea. And I said, I'm wondering if you might be interested in doing this with me. And he was like, yes, immediately. And so we launched in early March of 2019, researching and learning how to do it. We released our initial maybe 8 or 10 episodes in June of 2019. And then very quickly thereafter, and we started to source from people we knew who in the industry, whether that be other test prep professionals, other college professionals. And so by midsummer of 2019, Mike said, what we should probably create a Facebook group. So we created the Test Prep Tribe, which was supposed to be a closed Facebook group for test prep professionals, and a community where we could share ideas, share information about what was happening in our industry. So kind of a larger community that kind of extended from people we were meeting from the podcast. And then late fall of 2019, Mike and I say, we should do a conference. We should meet up with these other test prep people in person. And so we started planning a Test Prep Tribe conference in Boca Raton, Florida in January of 2020. So in January 2020, about 32 brave, sort of suspicious test prep people showed up, some of them whom we already knew, but some people we didn't know who showed up in Florida. We did a 2-day conference that was awesome. And it was everyone sharing expertise in the industry. And the outcome of that, Mike Bergen ended the conference saying, what do we need in the test prep industry? And it was sort of a call to Other industries have professional organizations. We don't have one. And so, kind of starting in February of 2020, a small group of us who later became the board, the initial board of the National Test Prep Association, we started meeting weekly, researching and planning what does it mean to start a nonprofit industry organization for test prep. So we started doing that in early February of 2020. Now, as you can imagine, we'd probably only been meeting for about a few weeks or a month, and COVID hits. Now, here's the thing. By this point in time, we'd already been Zooming, we were meeting, so we were really interacting. But I still remember, like, that was a big deal that we were doing Zoom. Like, we were meeting with people across the country, and Zoom was our vehicle, right? So, of course, that meant that when COVID hits, all of a sudden, Zoom is everything. And we were getting more people on. And so on March 20th, 2020, I hosted the first, it was Test Prep Tribe Happy Hour Zoom that later became the National Test Prep Association Happy Hour Zoom that happens every single Friday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard and has been going on since then. So essentially with COVID, now people really did need, colleagues in the industry. We were terrified of what was happening with test optional, tests being canceled. Like, we didn't know if we were going to have a job. Our industry really was under attack. And, for someone who'd had a business for, at that point, their own business for like 14 years, it was scary to think that my whole career could disappear, with testing, without testing. And so long story short, by the fall of 2020, we did have our formalized board, we had our bylaws, we launched a website, and thus the NTPA, in terms of being a website and sort of a real professional organization, had launched. And then NTPA we did a lot of professional development in that first year on Zoom. And then we had our first in-person conference in June of 2021 in Washington, D.C. So we've had June and December conferences ever since. We will be having our next December winter workshop, December 16th, 17th, in Nashville, Tennessee. And then we will have our next national conference in June of 2025 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So it's pretty exciting what we do. And, I've been on the board since, and we do amazing things. And to see how people's businesses have grown, thrived and grown exponentially in COVID times and in test optional times is just to me, the sweetest thing. Yeah. And that's the history of the NTPA. Yeah.
Great stuff. And to the listeners, they're wondering just the basics, who's it for, who can join, who cannot join?
Sure.
Is it limited to, is it defined by geography or all of those things?
So we realized almost immediately that we had we were not visionary enough, because while we are the National Test Prep Association, we have a number of international members. So to be fair, we do have a number of international members. And I will say, if I had to say what is a goal that I have, I would love to think that we could host a conference internationally. Actually, India is where Mike and I are targeting. But host an international conference. Yeah. If I can manifest anything, I want to be able to say, oh my God, we have now taken NTPA off of, our continent and taken it somewhere else, because there are test prep professionals everywhere. And so, but no, our membership is primarily people, educators who operate in the test preparation space. So our actual typical member is someone who is doing some kind of work with a test. Now that could be SAT, ACT, PSAT, that could be GRE, GMAT, LSAT, that could be HSPT, IC, SSAT. There are, could be AP, IB. Essentially there's no limit because there are so many different standardized tests. So if you are someone who is in that education space, prepping students for a test, a standardized test, if you are running a business in that academic tutoring learning space, Those are our primary members. But we also have affiliate members. So anybody who operates in a business or industry that's adjacent. So think like
Mhm.
college advising, educational resources,
Right.
services. Those are affiliate members. So we do have some different kinds of memberships. And we are growing every month. Our organization is growing. Every conference we have is bigger and better than the one we had before. So, but we have a code of ethics. So there is a code of ethics that one must follow in terms of joining the organization, and we hold very dearly to that code. So yeah, so it's a great organization. I would encourage anybody to check it out. So National Test Prep Association.org is where they can check us out if they're interested in learning more about the organization.
Awesome, Amy. And how did Leap happen?
So part of my story, obviously, is that over the course of the time that I've had our podcast since 2019 and kind of, again, created this community of people, and again, you could probably have sensed like networking, collaboration are the two most important things to me. And so I've met so many people, and one of whom was Lisa Marker Robbins, who owned Leap in Cincinnati. She started Leap in 1999. And if I'm in Cleveland, Northern Ohio, Lisa is in Cincinnati, Southern Ohio. So in a similar demographic, sort of families that we serve in Cleveland and Cincinnati, similar price points for our work, similar connections with schools and families, very aligned mission wise in terms of Leap and Seeley Test Pros. And so Lisa I've known her for a while, as a colleague and as a dear friend. And, she was hearing a lot of my struggles and like my work struggles about a year ago. And she said, actually, I might have an idea for you, if you'll entertain me. And she had been positioning her company to sell for a couple years. And she said, I've been waiting to sort of see if I could meet someone or find someone who I thought might be the right person, because she said, I don't want to sell it to venture capital. I don't want to sell it to somebody who
Right.
doesn't like feel the same way about it that I do. And so we started our talks in September of 2023, and we met weekly and we talked about what that would look like and kind of how her company operated, and ultimately trying to decide how both companies could benefit from each other, right? It was about how each of our companies could serve a role or serve a purpose in benefiting the other. And it was very clear immediately that there was so much potential kind of united as one. So, in July, the end of July 2024, the business was sold. I purchased it. And so I'm now the proud owner of Seeley Test Pros in Cleveland and Leap in Cincinnati, for about 3.5 months now. Yeah. And I'm going to Cincinnati tomorrow. I'm going to do my first sort of strategic planning with Elisa and my team. And really what we're trying to do is sort of figure out, like going into 2025, how we continue to align the companies and sort of intertwine, for greater efficiency and effectiveness. Yeah.
Wow. Congratulations, Amy. Just a little curious, you said Lisa positioned this as a solution to when you were discussing with her about her struggles. Do you mind sharing at any level that you wish what these struggles are? I'm just curious how buying another company is going to help you with
Sure.
your
No, 100%.
solving
Well,
your
I
struggles. Yeah.
think so I'll start with this. I think, as I mentioned earlier, many of us in test prep, we don't start companies. We offer services. We offer tutoring. So you start out as a solopreneur, much like I did. I left a
Right.
company and I'm just one single tutor. And I'm tutoring, and to my credit, I obviously am doing a good job because my business is thriving and growing purely based upon referrals. But you get to that point where all of a sudden, like I did, I can't handle all the work. So how do I bring somebody else in? And you bring someone in, or you bring people on, and you maybe don't have a system, you don't even have a structure. It's just kind of random. But before long, you realize the potential for growth, but there are things you've got to do to systematize, automate, to create efficiencies, right? And so in some cases, a lot of the people in our industry might not want to do that. So they stay in their own solopreneur role, and that's perfectly fine. And there are others who say, okay, wait a second, I want to create a business. Well, then once you've got a fully fledged business that's operating, you almost have a dilemma of, okay, now how do I leave it? Like, what's my exit strategy? Not that you, but it's interesting. I think now every business owner, whether they think they're too small or whatever, or they've great aspirations, you almost have to start the business as if you are eventually going to sell it. And that sounds
Right.
crazy, but I would say to anybody starting a company, start with the greatest vision you can have for yourself or your company, because that's going to make you create systems, SOPs, standing operating procedures, that will facilitate that, either for you as the owner to step back, for you as the owner to sell the company, And so for me, I only started to think about that a little bit about 5 years ago when I did a Goldman Sachs business program called 10,000 Small Businesses, which is excellent, by the way. Because it really expanded my way of thinking about my business. And at the time, I thought you expand your business by offering more services, right? Just more services. The thing I didn't listen to, because I wasn't thinking big enough, was you expand your market. And it was like, oh, I was having
Right.
trouble offering more services now for a lot of reasons, but one of which I'm like, oh, market. So this opportunity for me became, oh, that's a new market. But in terms of the challenges you were kind of asking about, is that when you start a business and you, the owner, are providing the bulk of the service, it's very difficult to grow, because what is the most common thing you're ever going to hear from a business owner is you have to start working on your business, not in your business. And so the dilemma is, if you're
Right.
doing all the tutoring, you don't have enough time to work on your business. So long
Right.
story short, the dilemma that had happened about a year ago was I was spending way too much time. I got pulled back in and I was doing way
Right.
more tutoring, and that I really should not have been doing. And so what that meant was now I didn't have enough staff. I should be hiring. I should be doing all these things. But of course, you're saying, I don't have time to hire because I'm tutoring too much. Well, that is not, that's the problem, right? It's the problem. So in any case, but I also was faced with this idea of, what do I want this business to do for me? And ultimately, it was this idea of, I need to reduce the amount of hours I spend tutoring. I need to focus more on business development. Because so much of our tutoring at Seeley Test Pros is on Zoom. All of LEAP's tutoring is on Zoom. There were some efficiencies to gain a staff of tutors immediately online. That could help me tremendously in Cleveland, and I didn't have to do any work or lift a finger. There was a team of long-standing tutors. I gained an operations manager. I gained a client service manager
Right.
immediately, where all of a sudden, me doing all of this, I could start to try to have staff that knew the industry, knew a business in this industry, and that I could start creating those efficiencies. So I'm nowhere near the efficiency I should be, which, I'll give myself the grace of I've only owned the company 3.5 months. But the point is, I need to create a business that at some point in time, if my children don't want to take it over, or if I want to reduce my role, I need a business that is operating, that can operate at a level that my ability to be reduced in that role, and to take advantage of, over the last 5 years between Facebook, Test Prep Tribe, NTPA, I have ACT, my relationship with ACT as a contract trainer, and lots of relationships with college admissions professionals. Like, there are so many places where I could be doing, there are more opportunities, but I
Right.
can't take advantage of those opportunities if I'm still doing all the tutoring. And so, so the idea is, it's a growing pain situation. It's painful for us to remove ourselves from the day-to-day service, but that is my intent. And I'd like to think in 5 years, I look back and say, wow, I can't believe I did that. Like, I can't believe I did it. So much like right now, I look back as I celebrate 5 years of the podcast and almost 5 years of the National Test Prep Association. I think to myself, I can't wait to see 5 years in the future, looking back and going, oh, I can't believe I did that. And so that's kind of the excitement for me, is this feeling of like what I can accomplish if I am intentional with it. And so I do encourage anybody to be intentional. It's hard sometimes, but I think as a business owner, we limit ourselves by not making our visions and our goals bigger, because they're scary. It's scary to have big vision, big goals. But I'm putting my big girl pants on, and so that we'll see what happens. Check back in 5 years, Jag.
Definitely. This is awesome story, Amy. This definitely seems like one, superpower hack or something that you pulled out of thin air to, do all that you probably kept postponing. And I think now the hat is going to shift more towards the business hat with time. And yeah, I'm sure you're going to miss tutoring with time.
I'm never going to stop. It's just going to be right. Like I think most of us in test prep understand the value of continuing to be connected.
Right. At least a little bit. Yeah.
But what does that look like? 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week? That's kind of, that's sort of the thing I'm going to figure out as time goes on. Yeah. Yeah.
Got it, Amy. Amy, there are still a bunch of questions that I haven't gotten into, but we are at the end of 94 minutes going. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
There are a lot of interesting stuff if I can, cut them all. So that's how it's going to be, repurposed. Yeah. Thank you for the time and for the sharing. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, always feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help or support. So just note. Okay.
Noted, Amy. Before we leave, I'm just going to stop the recording.